The David Bohm Society presents.
So if we were to say the point is, why does the perception disappear? How can we change? And what is it? I think a lot of the questions were around that sort of thing. Because exposing self-deception is the same sort of question. That is, how can we change? How can we be aware of self-deception though we're not, and so on. Now, see, one question, a fairly simple question, is why there are moments of clear perception, right? Perhaps due to some unusual incident, which might be danger or anything, which, as you said, wipe them out away. But it comes back. I mean, if you were to make the analogy, you could say if you turn the windscreen on the car, but if there's a lot of trucks passing by, then the mud comes right back, right? Because it's splashed up all the time. You see, how does this happen? You see, you have a property of thought called putting things in abeyance, you see. If you can put things aside and come back to them later, right? Normal thought requires that. So if you are angry, you can also put that in abeyance. See, something more interesting or important comes up, and that can be put in abeyance. Then when you are finished with this more interesting thing, you return to the anger, right? So let me propose that when something terrifically important or interesting comes up, all this other stuff goes into abeyance, you see. Right? And then when you are finished with that, it comes back. I mean, you get back to ordinary business, or to business as usual, right?
It may not even come back.
It may not, but I mean, the question was that it so often does, you see.
So the perception is that it's gone, but really isn't gone. It's just sort of subsided from the moment.
Yes, it's still there on the program, if you want to put it, if you make the analogy to a computer, right? And the computer program could be turned off to allow room for something else. But then when you're finished with that, you turn the program right back on, right? Therefore, that is clearly not good enough, right? Now, see, some understanding is, if it goes into abeyance, you haven't really understood what's going on. For some fortuitous reason, that has happened. And for an equally fortuitous reason, it will come back. It isn't even fortuitous. It's almost certain, in most cases, to come back, because you're bound to get, for that incident to cool down, and you're bound to get back to the ordinary state of affairs. Now, the thing is then that it's there all the time, but it is in the memory, if you want to put it that way, in the program. It's memory. You're not aware of memory. Do you see that? We don't know. No, scientists have tried to find out what the source of memory is, and there's no good theory. But one sure thing is that if you are not aware of the roots of memory, right? Memories come up, but where they come from, whatever it is. If you imagine that there was a program from which they come, you're not aware of that, right? That would be part of the process we were talking about, whereas the content is the memory itself. Now, you may remember that you've got to be angry, you see. For the moment, that was put aside, but as soon as you're finished, then you remember once again it's time to be angry. And there it starts again, right? Because after all, this outrageous thing, there's still a good reason to be angry because of this outrageous and unforgivable thing that has happened. You see, that has not been settled yet. You see, it has been accepted that is a good reason, and therefore anything which has a good reason, if your memory were to give up things which had good reasons, it would be a very poor memory, you see. Your memory is holding it, and it really should hold it, because it has been put down as a good reason, and anything with good reason ought to be remembered. So unless you get at that good reason, there's no way out, right? See, so thought is behind it. Though emotions are the apparent source of the trouble, thought is behind sustaining, the maintaining of these emotions, right? The thing, see, and a certain confusion of thought. One of the confusions we discussed this morning was about the thinker and the thought, this false division and so on. There are many such confusions. False, thoughts which play a special role because they organize thought. You see, that's something I'm going to come to, that some thoughts are just about other things, right, like the chair and the table and the room. But some thoughts play a much more key role. They organize other thoughts, right? And there may be thoughts which organize them. You see, you have that in the genes, you see. Some parts of the cell, first of all, some cells help to organize the rest of other parts of the body, and then certain parts of the cell, the DNA, help to organize the whole thing, right? So if something goes wrong with the DNA, this is far more serious than if something goes wrong with some other part of the process, right? A small mistake in the DNA can be very bad, right? A small mistake somewhere down here, well, it's not a serious problem, right? So you could compare this to a stream. Say we have a stream into which pollution is being poured near the source, and you start to remove it downstream while you pay no attention to the source, what's going on near the source, right? So the pollution is constantly going in, or else you could say that the misinformation at the source of the stream, whatever, if it's a stream of information, is constantly coming in, and you try to remove it downstream, right? You see, in general, we have been caught in that we don't even know about this source, right? And see, one of the things we want to do is to move toward the source of this trouble.
Such as childhood trauma?
Well, that's one theory, it's childhood trauma, but I want to propose something else, you see. I say various things may have happened in the past, but I think that's gone, you see. Now, it has left a mark in the sense of memory, right, which is active. But, see, what's interesting is not exactly what happened in the past, but how that has left a mark which is active now. You see, the past can be looked at as the indicator of what's going on at present. So if you look at the whole history of evolution, you can say that helps to give some insight into into the present organism as the result of all that past, you see. So we want to think, we're not really, it's an interesting story, but the past is gone and is not in itself significant beyond the fact that it has contributed to the present, right? Now, a certain structure, therefore we want to understand that structure, which I say is the kind going to the source. In each moment there is a source. The past will have contributed to building it up this way, but the present source is what we're after, right? See, if people are pouring pollution into the stream, you can go back and say, well, they're doing it for various reasons, going back into the past, and finally, maybe a long time ago, somebody decided to make a factory, and other people decided to make more and more, and therefore that's how it happened. But the important point is that the stuff is pouring in all the time now, right? That it's continuing. That we not giving up the negative features of the past, but holding on to them. So I want to say, we'll come back to this, that I call it a generative order. You see, first of all, the ordinary order of time is the order in which events follow or succeed each other, right? Time is the order of successive events, right? Okay. See, and Leibniz put it this way, a philosopher, time is the order of successive existence, and space is the order of coexistence, right? The order in which things coexist. Is that concept clear?
Somewhat.
Yeah. So, but anyway, let's focus on time. It's the order of successive existence, one thing following another. And that's what you were just talking about, going back into the past and seeing how one thing followed another until we finally got to where we are. That's one way of looking at it, and in fact, it's the most common way in which people look at it, right? But now you can look at it another way, which is the generative order, which is now, and which time is not the main point, right? If you look at the whole stream, you see, at one moment, you can see how it all works, right? From the source to the end. Suppose you're way up looking at it, right, from a satellite. So the idea is then looking at that whole stream, you see where all the pollution is pouring in all the time and where people are trying to get it out all the time, and you understand the problem. So now that's the approach I'm suggesting. We have got to look at the generative order, and you see in DNA we have an example of generative order. There's information, according to the theory, in the DNA which affects the making of protein, and that affects the making of cells and so on. You know, that may not be the whole story, but at least it's an interesting part of it. And and you can say if there's a small mistake deep in the generative order, it comes out as cancer, as deformed organs and all sorts of metabolic problems and diseases and so on, right? And therefore some sort of damage there or some misinformation there is going to be very serious. So if you alter the genes in an arbitrary way, it's like introducing misinformation into all this information, right? So if you now in society, you may also imagine we have a kind of generative order which is organizing it, and a lot of misinformation gets poured into it, and we try then to deal with the consequences of that. Or in the psyche of the individual, it's the same. You see, saying we want to think of moving toward the source, the generative source of this, rather than trying to correct it way down the line. Now, most of the efforts to deal with this problem have been done down the line under the assumption that the order of succession is the only order that's significant. That's clear. You see that?
Or the only order that could be touched.
That can be touched, yes. I'm suggesting that, you see, even in the case of DNA or in many other cases, people are at least touching the generative order in some way, though it may be very preliminary. That's in the physical domain. But now, suppose we think of touching the generative order in the mental domain and the socio-cultural domain, right? Because that's where our serious problems are. I mean, it's bad enough that we get cancer and things like that, but these other problems are far more serious, right? And because if we don't solve them, this other thing won't mean anything. Now, and in fact, you see, this misinformation in the generative order, you can see, say, catching a disease is like that. A virus particle carries information which enters the cell and takes over its functions, misinforms them to produce more viruses instead of doing their ordinary function. So you keep on multiplying this misinformation, right? So if you catch a disease, a cold, say you caught it from somebody else, but you actually caught a few particles which couldn't have hurt you. But you have provided an environment in which those particles could grow, and therefore you are the source of the disease, right? The disease is generated from your own chemistry, which is such as to be a good ground for those things to spread, right? To multiply. So the point is then that the same thing happens when we have mental problems, that say some sort of, we can say each thought acts like a virus particle, a certain kind of information. If it's misinformation, it can spread, and begin to take over, right? Because this information helps to organize the system, right? You see, as it does with the DNA. Now, okay, so we want to get to the generative order, and I'm saying, first of all, we're saying that in a way, the proposal that thought is behind it is a step toward the generative order. We're saying we see a vast mass of problems, and we have said they're generated from thought, right? That's the right. But then we say some thoughts organize the other thoughts, right? Thoughts about the thoughts about the way the mind works, the brain works, thoughts about thought, thoughts about society, thoughts about certain other things, about what the person should be and so on, are organizing the other thoughts, right? So they're further along up the generative order, right? Toward the source. Now, that's a thing to keep in mind. Maybe we'll return to that, but we want to look at it in that way. The generative order, in a way, is beyond, is one in which time is not the main point. Right? That is, it's at one instant you can see this generative order, and the order of succession may follow from it, but you understand the thing more deeply if you can see it that way. Now, one more point I'll say about that. See, the word generative, is the same root as the word general. And it's the same root as the word genus and gene. You see, the word general, generative, gene has to do with generation. It has to do with the origin, the source. You see, so what this suggests is that the general concept is closer to this source than the particular. Right? If I give you a sort of an image to say, if you take a tree, it comes up from the roots to the trunk, and then it goes out into all the branches. See, the branches are all the particulars. It separates into them, but the source is the trunk, right? So we're trying to say, in the way the mind works, the general is what you've got to get hold of, and which will then unfold into the particulars. Now, usually you deal with the problem the other way around, by looking at the particulars and trying to go from that to the general. Is that clear? In a typical problem and technical problem. So, but this may be the wrong way, dealing with particular problems. In fact, you can't deal with them. You see, they have their source further up the generative order. Now, therefore, something more general, for example, some general principles by which the ego is organized, or society is organized and so on, may be at the root of this whole unfolding set of branches, constantly branching out into little problems. So I'm suggesting a different structure of problems. We'll come back to that later. That there is a structure in our problems. They are not just one problem after another. And there will be an order and a structure in this whole thing. You see, we'll call it the order behind disorder, right? That is not a paradox, because the order, even in the case of cancer, you say that's a disorder, but there's a well-defined order behind it. The cells are growing too fast. They're not the cells keep on growing instead of stopping growth at the right point for the welfare of the organism. They just keep on growing. There's a well-defined order in which they grow, but it's the wrong order, right, for the organism. So you call cancer a disorder, but it is simply an order not compatible with the survival of the organism. Right? So there's a so-called disorder in thought, but it is simply an order not compatible with our survival, you see. There is an order there to our disorder. And in fact, every medical discovery depends on that notion, right? That behind the disorders there is an order which allows you to treat it. So in a way, we're looking into this order, the structure of thought. Right? Saying, can we get some insight into all that? Now, well, I think we'll come back to that later, but now the point is, what we say that there is such a, we don't see how to get into this, what to do about it. Of course, we need some insight into it to guide our whatever we're going to do, right? That's why we're talking about it and trying to look into it. Right? So we're not blind as we look into it. And also, we've said another feature of the structure is this mud, right? That something is constantly obscuring our perception. I could make another analogy, which I'll come back to. If you imagine some machine that's constantly creating a cloud of smoke, right? And this machine is hidden in the cloud of smoke, you see. That's our problem, right? So what are we going to do, right? Now, but we see the importance. Somebody raised that question. We see the importance of going on with this, right? That not to give up, right? Now, I'm going to make one proposal, of how we can get started. You see, we can come back to anger or to any of those problems and say, what are we going to do? You see, we have got into this question of the observer and the observed, or the thinker and the thought, by saying, I am angry. That is automatic. You see, it has been said so many times by everybody that it comes out, it's on the memory, it's on the program, and it comes out just like that, right? I am angry, right? Now, what we think about how thought is working is crucial. By thinking that that's what is happening, we have created this sense of two things being there, an observer and an observed, and one has got to control the other. A structure that is totally, as I'm saying, illusory. Right? And if we attempt to, if the system attempts to act according to an illusory structure, it's just going to be chaotic. Right? Now, so the first point is, can we get out of that? You see, now it seems. See, you may say we've got to get beyond thought, we've got to stop thinking, we've got this, but how are we going to? Right? But the thing to notice is that you're in trouble because of a thought, a number of thoughts, but one of them is, I am angry. Right? That thought is making it impossible to get at the problem. Right? Now, therefore, how can we change that? See, I'm going to propose that instead of thinking about anger, when you say I am angry, you are thinking about anger. And when you think about something, the thing you think about is different from the thinker and the thinking process. I'm going to propose something different, which is to think anger. Now, you see, when you're really angry, you are thinking anger. You see, you're not thinking, at that moment, you're not thinking about it. You are thinking, I have good reason to be angry. You're quite serious about it. I mean, you're not thinking about the fact that you have good reason to be angry, right? You're not, I'm not thinking, I think I have good reason to be angry. I don't know how to put it. You would never even put it that way, to think about the fact that you have good reason to be angry. You are thinking, I have good reason to be angry. You see the difference? You mean it, right? Now, suppose, you try to, you see, now in order to, but you see, this will do no good if we get carried away by anger. You won't be able to look at what's happening. You see, suppose you say, I accept the fact that I have good reason to be angry. I think I have good reason to be angry, and I accept that as true. Then I will be angry, and I will just shout or do something. And I will not be able to look, you see, because in order to carry out a thought, you have to accept that it is right. Is that clear? To carry out any thought, you must begin by assuming that it's right or believing it's right. If you believe that the thought is right, you will never be able to question it. Right? On the other hand, if you put it in abeyance or just suppress it or something, then there's nothing to look at, right? You could say, either I'm overcome by anger and I can't look because anyway I'm accepting that thought, I'm compelled to accept it, or it goes into abeyance and there's nothing to see. And you see the difficulty. But there's a place in between, right, which is to think anger, but to suspend the action, right? And suspend the belief, if you can, that in the rightness of your reason.
What action is it that you're suspending?
Well, the first action is that you're not going to have an outburst of anger, right? If you have that, then you surely will see nothing.
Is thinking anger also an action?
Yes. I'm not saying you suspend all action. You see, I'm saying there's a certain... You're going to suspend the reaction to that thought, right? If I think anger, the first reaction is, I must say something or do something. You say in primitive conditions they would probably punch somebody in the nose or do something. And in our more civilized conditions you say something nasty, right? And now none of those say so, or else make a nasty expression or something. You see. So the point is now. Suppose we say, See, now the first reaction of anger may be too powerful for you to do that. But now suppose it subsides. But we know it hasn't gone, right? Therefore you can call it up again by thinking anger. You can think, I am angry, I have good reason to be angry because of the outrageous and unforgivable thing that has happened, right? And think exactly, you have to go through and say, what is it? And you will find yourself getting angry. I mean, do you accept that? That's very interesting, you see, because you see how you may think at first anger is an extremely spontaneous reaction of your gut feelings. But here you are getting angry by just repeating this thought. It's beginning to show something of the structure, right? That it's not the one you thought it was.
Dr. Bohm, at the moment of anger, you are angry.
Well, then let it subside, you see.
Then you let it dissipate.
It doesn't dissipate, it subsides, see, right?
The source is still there, isn't it?
It's still there on the program, right?
And then the more you think about it, the madder you get.
Right. Well, let's think about it, and you find yourself getting more and more angry, right? You say, well, at first, the usual reaction to that is to say, that's terrible, I don't want to get more and more angry, it's a lot of trouble, it's unpleasant, I may do something wrong, but I'm going to suspend the action, yeah? Now that'll create still more pressure, right? Inside. It'll intensify the feeling and create still more pressure. And the point is that is the key to learn something about it. This suspended action, and if you can, we'll go later to the notion of suspending the thought, which is much harder. Suspending the belief in the correctness of the thought, right? If you suspend the action, you will already feel something. You want to do something, and you're not doing it, right? Now, you've got to get over this notion that that's bad, right? Because that's another thought says that's bad. I've got to stop that. I mustn't go on with this. Now, but if you sustain this, then there will be a pattern of reactions over the body, the autonomic nervous system, the tensions in the body, the heartbeats, and so on, all that goes with anger, right? And I'm going to say that will be the indicator, the clue to what's behind it. So you create sort of a mirror for the whole process by doing this.
Aren't they the same reactions that you had with fear, though?
Fear, I took anger because that's usually the easiest. I think fear is much harder. There are other things like fear and panic and hate and so on. And these are much harder.
Loss of oxygen.
What?
Inadequate oxygen supply will do the same thing.
Yes, well, but I'm trying to say that I want to see the connection between the thought and the reaction. Because we've said one of the things that was lacking was proprioception. Right? We do not see the connection between the thought and the action, right, or the feeling. Now, one way to begin to see it, one reason we don't see it is either we carry it out without any question, we don't see there's no way to see the thought if you're accepting it. The other, that's true, the other is we just simply put it in abeyance and say, I'm not angry, you see. I was angry, but I'm no longer angry, it's all okay, you see. And therefore there's nothing to see. But I'm saying there's somewhere in between where you can see this connection between thought and the rest of the process. Right? Is that clear what I'm saying? I mean, if anybody, I don't know whether you can do it now, but try to call up something that makes you angry and see how it works. Maybe you'll prefer to do it on another occasion.
So you're saying that a person, given a moment where they could give it attention, could call up something that may have made them angry, or
And that
could-
still makes them, they're still
Right.
angry about it.
Right, and then instead of resisting it or saying, well, I shouldn't be angry, which is just another thought, or letting the anger blossom and go completely out, that there's this point in between where there's a kind of balancing whereby one would have difficulty convincing themselves that the anger was real because they'd be constantly seeing that thought was creating it.
Well, you will feel all the reactions. You see, if you think the thought seriously and not just play around with it, you see, this has got to be an occasion that really makes you angry.
All right, okay, but we're talking about when we do this. Now we're doing this.
Yeah.
It's happening right now. I'm getting mad, okay? I'm getting really, but I'm not going to get angry, not because I'm resisting it, but because I am going to go, there's going to be this kind of pulsating back and forth between the thought that makes me angry and the feeling of anger. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, or else having them both there together and fighting, with under tension. And there's a kind of state of tension all over, right?
All right, okay.
And now that's very unpleasant, right?
Well, it could be, I don't.
Well, I suspect that it will be. You see, that if it builds up, it might be unpleasant and a bit frightening
Okay,
and so on.
uncomfortable, right. There could be
Uncomfortable, yes,
Plus,
you
there's a
see.
tremendous amount of energy being
Yeah.
generated in a
And
small.
you'll want, therefore, to stop it, you see. Right?
But we're not going to stop
Yes, because why not?
because we're doing this on purpose in order to see what happens.
But why are we doing it?
I guess to see the reality of the situation.
But why do we want to see that? You see, we want to try to get to the bottom, to answer one of these questions as to what will keep us at it, right?
All right. So you mean what is our motivation for continuing with this action?
Why should we do a thing that's so unpleasant and, apparently unrewarding and so on?
To see its source,
Yes, and why do we want to do that?
to end conflict.
Yes, okay, and why? Maybe if we'll push that a little further.
The conflict's larger and more dangerous and more discomforting than even anger.
Yes, this will eventually tie into the whole problem of mankind. You see, I'm trying to say that this gets close to the generative source of all the problems. Right? Is that clear? It happens, as this gentleman said, it happens with fear, it happens with in panic, it happens with hate, it happens with desire, it happens in many other ways. And and all these things have this sort of thing going on. If we can get a perception here, we have seen at least the pattern which might hold generally, and therefore generatively.
I think that's what I was trying to say before when I said the thought creates a feeling, and then you said watch the thought create the feeling, and I said it's easier for me to see the feeling and then watch it how it creates another thought. That's what it seems to me we're talking sort of the same kind of thing, because that's going back and forth and back and forth on a more. Anger's a
Right.
big, easy, hard thing to watch while they're thinking, but it creates a feeling also. What you're asking is
Watch both, yeah.
all right, there's this kind of a
Okay, so watch when you repeat, but it's important to see, one of the forms of deception is to say, I'm not going to think about it, I won't put any words there, and I'm now outside the verbal domain. You say, I'm doing it non-verbally, but it's not so easy, right? Because you're still caught in that whole process. And you've got to, we are using the words not for the sake of their meaning or content, but for the sake of setting the process in motion that has to be watched. Do you see the difference? See, we're not using words to try to explain it or to, to make theories about it or anything, or to control it. But rather, the word is used as the switch that turns it on, right? You can't watch it if you don't turn it on. And there's an automatic tendency to turn it off, you see. So, therefore, the next point is, okay, but we must be careful that we don't carry it out, because that will not only be very bad itself, but also it will prevent us from looking, right? So anyway, and you can watch the thought and the feeling. You see, the thought has an effect, you can see that. And the effect has an effect, right? The feeling affects the thought, because you find it very hard to give up the thought in the presence of that feeling.
yeah, especially if you have a feeling.
What?
Especially if you have the feeling.
Yes, but I mean, if you have no feeling, then the anger is not there, right? So now the important thing is to see that it's one joint process. Anger is not just feeling, it's not just thought, but it's that cycle. The maintaining of anger is the cycle, right?
Right.
And maybe a burst of anger could occur as a spontaneous feeling at the animal level, but then the animal, without, at least up to animal, which perhaps the chimpanzees can maintain it because they've got thought, but say more simple animals cannot really maintain that sort of anger, right? Now, you see, there's no doubt that this thought is involved in maintaining anger. You see, perhaps it would be interesting to consider that I told you about Jane Goodall and the chimpanzees who could maintain anger and hate against the chimpanzees on the other side of the mountain. Probably they could make an image of them, because now I see a dog cannot do that, or at least very rarely. You see, we had a dog once who got very angry always got angry at the neighbor dog when she passed, but you had to drag the dog away, and dragging the dog around the corner, then the dog suddenly, the anger stopped. The dog was highly agitated and didn't seem to know why she was agitated. But she just was puzzled, you see, because once she got around the corner, she could not form the image of the other dog who was so hateful. and and therefore, the whole thing stopped, you see. It shows how image and anger, in this case it wasn't thought, there was a kind of thought in recognizing the other dog, but it required the actual presence of the other dog to maintain this thing, right?
That has some survival value, I should think.
Oh yeah. Oh yes, I mean, I'm saying at the animal level this all has a good reason, but when it comes to forming images, it becomes very dangerous. You see, with the chimpanzee, for example, it produced this behavior of meaningless killing of other chimpanzees, and with human beings it gets more and more dangerous, and it to the atomic bomb and ecological and all sorts of other problems. But I mean a number of those animal reactions, which had survival value, in the presence of thought, become very dangerous. And so you can see thought is required to sustain anger. You see, the animal has anger in the presence of whatever it should be angry at, but it doesn't go away and can keep up a grudge for a long time or something. So let's come back to it. That here we are caught in this cycle, and between thought and the older reactions of the system, the older structure of the system, and which is common to the animal, right? Both in the autonomic nervous system and also in the older parts of the brain, right? Like the emotional and the sensory motor movement functions of the brain and so on. And so I'm suggesting here we can begin to make a step. You see, remember we said we have all this mud on our spectacles. Anger is helping to produce it, right? This sustaining anger. And we said to see is the first priority, right? And I see to see is the first priority, right? So then I say, what am I going to see? See, if I let anger go into abeyance, I have nothing to see, and if I carry it out, I can't look, right? Right. So now I'm saying I'm beginning to see it. One of the problems is that the brain apparently doesn't want this thing to be seen. Well, perhaps we can go into that later. That there is a genuine wish to conceal all this stuff, and therefore to keep, that's one reason why it's so hard to look at. So we want really to get something to look at, which is significant and relevant and so on. And so I'm saying, you just think anger, and get the process going, right? And then begin to observe, to begin to be aware, sensitive, and attentive to what's happening, right? And you can begin at first now to see the connection between thought and the reaction of feeling in the body and the way it goes back, right? Now, that already begins to show that it is not as significant as it appeared to be at first sight.
David, could you say a little more exactly what you mean by think anger?
You see, when you are really angry and you begin to justify it, I say you are thinking anger. You say, you're really very serious and engrossed in it, right? And you're saying, if you think about it, I have good reason to be angry. You won't use exactly those words, but it'll mean that, right?
Isn't it mainly that you call up an image of that person or that event and what that person said on that occasion?
That's right, but that's important. You have to say what he said, and what he said, it's important. The meaning of that is that it is good reason to be angry. What he said had to have this quality of being outrageous, unforgivable, or something, which gives good reason to be angry. If it doesn't lead to that, it won't work, right?
So one calls up the image of that person saying that thing or thinking
That's right, saying that thing, and then spells it out and says, that means I have good reason to be angry. See, not leave it implicit, right? Because if you leave it implicit, then you can lose it, right? It works when it's implicit, but you don't see it working. So is it clear then? We're going to call this anger up, right? In this way, and going to be aware of it.
One of the things it seems to do is turn anger into an act.
It is an act, I mean.
We thought it was totally serious. I had no control over it. I can't help that these things make me mad. I mean, you get mad too if you understand. And all of a sudden you're sitting there looking at it and you go, well, if I can do this on purpose and create this feeling, then what's the reality of it?
Well, it has no serious reality. So I'm trying to say that the maintaining of anger is an act. You see, but
that's one of the things.
Yeah, you see, you can look at it from the point of view of an actor. You see, an actor has got to make various movements and express feelings and so on. But in order to do so, he must understand the thought of the character. Right? He studies the script. He must really get a feeling and an understanding of the thought of that person. Right? The deep thought, the generative thought, right, from which it follows, so he doesn't have to think every minute, right? And therefore his actions convey that deep thought which forms the character.
And he has to act like what we would recognize
it happens
as an angry
naturally. He doesn't have to do anything special. If he once understands that, then it will flow naturally. The act will flow. You see, he needs some direction to be sure it's right, but it's got to come from him if it's good, right?
Right.
And so he's got to immerse himself in the character, you see. He's got to understand the character. Perhaps even sympathize with it, right? With that character. And then he's going to do various things. He's going to get feelings which are very similar to the feelings that the character would have, but a very slight difference, which is he knows he's acting, right? If he passed over that little line, then he would be insane, right?
Or angry.
Yeah, you see. So he's got to portray anger in a very convincing way, right? Now, how can he do it? Does he just imitate every gesture of an angry person from the outside? No, he must have the thought of the angry person. He's got to be very convincing, right? And so, therefore, it's so close to the real thing, you would wonder what is the difference. You see, you see, now in this act, which is really one of the forms of the imagination, you see, in imagination you are sort of acting out within you a certain image, right? The image is not a visual image only, it's an auditory image. It's not only that, it's a feeling image, an image of will and desire, and so on, right? It's an image of the whole being, which is conveyed by the actor, right? And so now, therefore, and also you have props, you see, real props to help support the image, right? Well, that happens also in the body, you see. Well, for example, there are displays of anger in more primitive creatures that when another creature encroaches on their territory, they will go through a whole display, which is aimed at discouraging this encroachment, right? Convincing the other one that it'd be better not to come in, right? And see, it's not aimed at having a fight. It's aimed really, probably, at avoiding a fight. But now so that goes back to our reptilian ancestors, right? As well as our mammalian. And so we have these rituals and displays, and we act them out. And the point is now that the first burst of anger might be so instinctive you wouldn't call it an act, but when you're blocked or frustrated. But then, how is it maintained? You see, it has to be maintained by a procedure very similar to how the actor maintains the expression of character, right?
So you're getting very close to how all this is maintained, is through some kind of learned action that now we've been convinced is so real that we're...
It now becomes fairly automatic. You see, you do it a number of times and you don't have to pay it a lot of attention, you see.
Plus we forget that we weren't aware that it was a learned kind of thing anyway.
Yeah. You see, so eventually it becomes so automatic you hardly know you're doing it, but but it is an act, you see, that is... but you see, it's not clear, we haven't got to the bottom of it. You see, at first you can see that the actual whole process is an act, but what's keeping it going, what fuels it is this. You believe the thought that you have good reason to be angry, right?
Right.
If you didn't believe that, then it would collapse.
Right. Because we can all think of something that might insult somebody else that we couldn't get angry over.
Yeah. Yes, you see, suppose you say, he insulted my mother, or he insulted my country, my religion, something sacred to me, right? And and that is good reason to get very angry. Right. And now, there we are. You see, now I believe it is a good reason. I accept that it is a good reason. You see, now somebody else might come along and say, I don't think it's a good reason at all. You see. But he can't be affected by that. Right. There seems to be some pressure forcing him to accept that reason. Right. Do you see? As long as you accept that reason, you cannot stop it, right? But see, what we can do is begin to look at it by acting it out again and within us, right? Acting it out is unfortunately means going outward, but acting it in, if you like. Right. See, we repeat the words, and we will discover that the feelings come, and also that forces us to maintain the thought, right?
If we take the feeling seriously, the thought would automatically be regenerated, and then it would...
Yes, but we do take the feeling seriously, and one of the reasons we take it seriously is because we do not see the connection clearly to the thought. You see, in the first instance, we think something, and a bit later the feeling comes up, and it is taken to mean that is an independent reality, which is a gut feeling, something very important. See, now we've said that there may be many feelings which are really very important, but this is imitating one of those, right? Because the imitation, the magician's trick is that you do not see how the thought is connected. You see, the magician always works a trick by doing something else happens, and you do not see the connection between what he did and what happens. Right? Therefore, it seems to happen by itself. Now, I had a thought that I have good reason to be angry, and various things. I didn't see the connection, right? And then the feeling came, therefore, it's quite natural to say it's a gut feeling, very important, right? A proof that an instinctive feeling showing me the truth of all this, right?
It's real.
It's real and true, right?
Right.
And now that is maintained by not seeing the connection, right? What I'm suggesting is we are beginning by bringing this up, by thinking anger, as I said. You are beginning to see the connection. But you'll see there's a tremendous resistance to seeing the connection.
And that resistance is because we have identified with the reality of the situation.
Well, it's not clear why. Yes, it may be much more complex than that, but I mean, in some way we are defending this structure, right?
We have some value that we think it has.
Yes.
And there seems to be a collective agreement to defend something, as say in watching a film where there's a deception being employed and the whole audience is into this I mean, it's all pervasive.
Yes, well, of course, the magician, we all like to be deceived because it makes an interesting experience, but entertaining experience, right? But but then other people, as you're saying, might accept deception in a much more serious way, right? And there's a resistance. You see, this deception, even using the word deception, you see, is troublesome because there's a kind of a tone of moral condemnation about it, right? Which gets in the way of what we want to do, you see, because if we condemn it, it is going to sort of go into abeyance, right? You're going to think I'm not that. Whatever you condemn, you're going to think I'm not that way at all, right?
So on a deeper level, one would have to be willing to have any thought that came up and not have any, and experience the thought without acting on it.
Well, if there's something doubtful about the thought, we have got to begin to pay attention to what's going on, right?
Well, there's a lot of thoughts that people aren't willing to have. And those are the ones that they need to look at, the ones they're willing to have.
Well, you mean the ones they're willing to admit they have, right? To acknowledge,
right.
to acknowledge to themselves.
Willing to allow to come out and stand in front of them in this way that we're talking about.
Yeah. The thoughts are there, but people don't want to acknowledge them, right?
Right, so there's always this constant, the thought trying to pop out and somebody trying to hold it in.
Yeah.
But to be willing to say, wake up in the middle of the night and have some horrible thought that I thought I never could have, and to let it do its shimmering dance or whatever it is, would be what is necessary in order for me to start to understand the source of these things.
Yes, that's right, and also for it to die. You see, like Krishnamurti has said, let the thing flower and die, you see. Right. Now, I'm trying to say, but we are automatically conditioned not to let it flower, right?
Right.
Because we don't like it at all, you see. We say, and now, therefore, I'm saying we may help it to flower a bit, you see, by sustaining this, by producing this suspended state, by bringing the thought out, you see, because by seriously expressing the thought to yourself or something, right?
By being willing.
Yeah.
There has to be that willingness that when it comes up, some thoughts just can't be brought up, but when they do come up, to be willing. A thought in itself isn't anything until you act on it.
Yes, but it acts by itself. You see, that's not quite true. You see, the trouble is that thought acts before you decide whether you're going to act or not. That's where the problem is.
Well, when we were talking about having anger, if we actually acted on that anger, that would be the problem. But
if we don't do anything about it, that's the first reaction, is that we just act, right? We get a feeling and we act, and then later on it's overlaid by another thought saying, I shouldn't do it, I shouldn't be angry, and therefore that anger apparently subsides, it goes into abeyance, right? But the structure is still there.
And that's becoming the structure of the conflict that we live in.
Now that's worse. You have then turned it into something worse than anger, because you have made it a conflict between anger and the attempt not to be angry.
And that becomes the source of those two things that we have, the self and the thing, the controller and the thing that's
that's right. And vice versa, that notion helps to support the conflict, right?
Right.
If there were not that notion, there would be no meaning to the conflict.
Right. The conflict is the result of something.
But the conflict is not possible unless there's somebody there to fight, right? Right.
Already, right. It's sort of one more circle.
And something he's got to fight. There's got to be two things for the conflict. Right? So therefore, the thought creates those two things, as the telephone is created in the television image, right? The thought creates the sense of me who is looking and fighting, and that anger which I'm looking at and fighting, right? And we'll have to go into how that's a very subtle process, but see, I'm saying that we've discussed that this is one of the key mistakes which is close to the generative order of the whole problem, of all human problems. If that stopped, I'm just saying now, I don't ask you just by way of, I think that if that stopped, most human problems would collapse. That distinction of the observer and the observed.
Right.
But so much else would collapse that people are rather frightened to contemplate. As the entire structure of society could not be sustained as it is now. So anyway, but now coming, there's such resistance to allowing yourself to see through that division of the observer and the observed that I say, let's not start there, right? Let's start on anger, which seems something, not quite so difficult. And and it's rather common. And so I say, let's try to think the thought which which sustains anger, and to suspend the action. And then you will get a display. Let me just put this one concept. I think we'll have to make a break. A display of the process. You see, you see there's something funny going on, because, as you just said, you can stir up this anger by means of words, and yet you had previously thought this anger is a deep, spontaneous thing welling up from all heaven knows where, right? There's already something funny going on, right? Now, I'm saying, rather than worry about the content of this anger process, I'm going to consider it to be a display. You see, I'll use television analogy again. It's our modern medium, so they have television stations put out a display card which has lines and things on it, and if the lines are not straight, it's a sign something is wrong with your set, right? However, if you thought that the content was important, you would then say, these lines are not straight, the program is wrong, call up the television station to alter the card until the lines are straight. You see, that is what we are doing mentally, right? So we are, when we see something is not straight, we try to straighten it out. Now, rather, let us look at it differently. If this process is not straight, this is the display card for what's going on. You see, the technician does not try to straighten out the lines by changing the card, but he says that a sign of a fault in the set, which in this case he may put a screwdriver or something to correct it, right? So I'm saying this anger process, which is not straight, is a sign of a fault in the system, right? It is not interesting in itself. It is rather trivial. Its content is really quite trivial. You will see that it's always the same in everybody, and it's always equally trivial, right? And just as the content of the test card is quite trivial too. These lines and squares and so on are not interesting at all as a content. But they do display a fault, right?
Would it be true to say that all resistance in general is reflective of this process, as anger is just an example?
It's only an example. You see, if you could, I would say do it with fear, do it with panic, but that, obviously, if you can't do it with anger, it's not likely you're going to do it with panic, right? Now, yes, so let's end up on this thought, which we'll come back to, that there is a display. That is, the anger process, the fear process, the hate process, the jealousy process, I don't know, all these other things, the desire process, the pleasure-pain process, they're all signs of something that is not straight, They're signs of a fault in the system. Can they be used in that way to help correct the fault? Saying we are not interested in solving the anger problem, and it's too trivial to be solved.
It would point to the fault for sure.
It points to the fault, and there are two things. One, how does it point to the fault? And secondly, how can an action take place guided by that pointing, right? What kind of action? You see, now that's a very big change in the way we look at the whole thing. You see, instead of saying anger, fear, etc. are deep, tremendously significant problems we've got to solve, you see, you have plenty of evidence that they're not all that significant, because we've just said if something more interesting happens, this thing will go into abeyance. You can see you're carrying out an act, and it's not all coming from anything very deep, and so on. See, it's not that I'm imposing this view on you. I'm saying I think I've given evidence that it is a rather trivial process, very mechanical.
And even the thing you hold the anger in abeyance for is another trivial.
Yeah, that's all. The entire process, which occupies so much of the minds of the human race, is fairly trivial.
And that brings us to that question why we're not willing to be nothing.
It may bring us to that. Yes, you see, we may discover that if we gave that up, what's left, right?
It seems like nothing because we've invested all our energy in it.
Yeah, we say, what in the world will be left if we give all that up? There'll be nothing interesting left to occupy us. What?
Maybe that's why we don't give it up.
Well, that's another thought, you see, but it contributes, right? You see that. So why, therefore, you see, it is really a rather worrying thought, or even frightening, that most of what is occupying our mind is quite insignificant and without value, and even destructive, right?
And it's merely a projection.
It has no substance at all. It has no more substance than the telephone in the image.
And that's what we call the self.
Well, that's what we think the self is. I don't know what the self is. You see, I'm not trying to tell you that there's no self. I don't know. You see, I'm saying that what we generally attribute as the self is that.
It is very, very frightening to think of giving that up, because the priorities that you were speaking of last night would dramatically shift.
Yes, and our whole society depends on priorities to hold it together, right?
But the priorities we have are demonstratively destroying the society. So
Yeah.
we're sort of in a little bind here.
Yes, I mean, that's our bind, yes.
And as long as we look at it as a problem, we'll maintain it.
Yes, because, you see, to look at it as a problem would presuppose there was some real substance to this, some rational order, and so on, and it could be solved. But, you see, it's like the problem of what to do with the telephone and the television image, you see, if it's not working right.
You purposely did not pick the pleasure program?
Well, I will wish to discuss that. I mean, I think we should get to it.
I think that would be a different case.
No, it's the same case, but I'm saying the anger business program is the easiest one to get into. The pleasure, pain is harder, panic is harder, hate is certainly harder.
The anger doesn't really provide us with pleasure or security.
It promises to do so. You see, let's discuss that.
The idea that if I let somebody talk about my mother like that, then my self-image is all messed up, because I'm not that kind. I'll fight for my mother or my country or all the things that you mentioned before. Mm-hmm. And I think that goes straight through about the things that make me angry and pleasure and pain and the whole things, that these mess up my self-image. And so I have to protect the self-image, or otherwise, as we were saying, if that means that I'm not who I think I am, and this is bad.
And if you can do it on purpose, how real is it? See, that's what we allow ourselves to have these trigger mechanisms to prove that they're real. And he's saying that if you could do it on purpose, how real can it be?
Well, that's
I mean, that would be the next question that would say, well, if I can hear what I thought was totally real, my love of country, or my hate of such and such, or my fear, and I can do it on purpose, I can just sit here in this room and get mad for no reason other than I remember having been mad one day.
Yeah.
And then how real is it?
It may not be all that real, you see.
Well, it's real enough to have killed 100 million people between 1914 and 1954.
Well, yes, but that was apparent, really. And that's really, I mean, what is real enough to kill somebody over?
Yes, but if there were a news broadcast put out that there was a nuclear war starting, it might produce real havoc. You see, and yet it would have no substance, almost no substance behind it at all, right?
Sure.
That's the problem, that we take these illusions to the point we are willing to kill 100 million people
we make
for.
them real.
If we weren't willing to do that, we could sit here and have all the anger and fear. I mean, we could be in a room full of fear, and if nobody acted upon it, it would just be some strange phenomenon. But the problem is, one of us is going to jump up and start punching, and I'm the biggest guy around.
Well, sure, what true American would kill 100 million
Right.
Russians to keep from going to the Gulag archipelago?
I don't blame him one bit.
Right, okay, well, on that note, we'll stop.
dbohm.com